Many Catholics have a difficult time having a calming and peaceful prayer life because of the many distractions. These distractions can be the background noise of children crying or people talking at Mass, or even as small as annoying smells by others. Many of us have distractions in our own mind, thinking about work, family, or business obligations, or even letting our mind wander. Hello everyone, today's episode is about helping us avoid distractions and focus our mind in prayer so prayer can be calming and peaceful, even if the external world is noisy and chaotic. We will be discussing the four main distraction points, which are external senses, the passions, preoccupations and wandering of our intellect, and sin and scruples.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Cease. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins with my time in the Marines. One of the things that the Marines always judge us on is this little criteria in our performance evaluation called presence of mind. And it's one of those ability to think even though you're under physical, emotional, and psychological duress. And so the way that they do that in a lot of our evaluation is they put your whole body in duress. And the reason why they do that is, one, to train your mind so that it can still think under duress. But second is to train our bodies that we can handle the physical, emotional, and psychological pressures that occur, especially in combat. So they try to do that as realistically as possible without, having us killed and seeing other people getting killed. So one of the things that happened to me in Marine Corps boot camp was it was actually more of a punishment than it was a lesson, but all of our punishments were always a lesson. So we were out in the field. It was a 3-day war, and we were. This was the first time we ever made our tents. I always tell my kids, Marines don't use tents because we're constantly in the move. But this one time, they wanted to show us how to make a tent and actually, sleep in one for this one night. So it was raining all day, and we were soaking wet. And we didn't get back to our tent until probably, I would say, at least 10 o'clock at night. And so we're there, and we're trying to get changed, and things are getting kind of chaotic, and recruits are talking. And our drill instructor, in fact, it was the senior drill instructor, got really, really angry, and he starts yelling at us to quiet down and just get changed. So none of us did, of course. And so he screams out, 0. Now, 0 means freeze. That means you don't move. You don't make any sound. It's completely nothing. Now, because it's completely black, he can't see if any of the recruits are doing anything except for by sound. So he hears a couple of us, and not me, I actually froze, but he hears the recruits, some of the recruits actually talking and rustling leaves. And he gets even angrier. And so he makes us stand at attention, right? All of us in a straight line, which we were side by side by the tents. And so he starts saying, I'm going to do it by the numbers, which means that we have to get undressed and dressed by his order. So he makes us completely get undressed. So all of us, there's probably like almost 70 recruits there, we're all naked, standing at attention. And he has us standing at attention, which felt like a daze, but it was probably only about 5 or 10 minutes. And all you can feel, now if you ever seen mosquitoes at Paris Island, those things are huge. They're about the size of a dragonfly. Now I'm not exaggerating. They are. They're about the size of a dragonfly, and their needle is about the size of a syringe. That's how big they are. And you can actually feel them hovering around you. And as we stood at attention, there was no movement, you could feel them landing on your skin. And we're not talking about one or two. We're talking about hundreds all over your body. And because we're naked, it's also landing on your private areas as well, both front and back of your private areas. So they are biting us or needling us or whatever you want to call it. And so you can hear a slap here and there, and the drill instructor's walking down the line just telling the recruits to stop moving because you're at tension. And we're there. And I could just feel these mosquitoes biting me all over my body. And I did not move. Eventually, I got kind of numb to the situation and just stood there at attention. And then eventually he had us get dressed. So we got dressed. The next day, I must have had welts all over my body, including my private area as well, with mosquito bites. And they were very itchy as well. So you can train your mind. You can train your mind. You can train your body. That's what military people do. That's what boot camp does. That's what training does. That's what exercises do, is to train your body and your mind. And so today we're going to talk about how to avoid distractions by training ourselves. Okay? It's not this, God doesn't give us this grace to do prayers automatically perfectly. But he gave us an intellect and a will so that we can train our bodies and our soul and our intellect to focus and concentrate on prayers. So let's talk about what prayer is. Now, if you go to my episode 14 on prayer, you'll find that prayer is this. Prayer is the elevation of the mind to God. That's what it is. All right? So we elevate our mind to God. So it's a very use of our mind. Now, what does that mean? That means that our intellect is involved. And who controls the intellect? Ourselves, our will. We have to will this. Just like, if I'm distracted at a classroom, I'll never know what the professor says, right? But if I focus on the teacher or the professor, then I'll learn the material that needs to be done. So I have to actually control my intellect to pray. And that's why it's a virtue. So prayer is a virtue. It doesn't come naturally to people. We have to actually do it. No different than, if you get a person who runs and they like to run, that's great. But if that person wants to win the Olympics or win a cross-country sport, then you would get a trainer to train that person to be the perfect runner, okay? So we do the same. We have to train our bodies to become that perfect runner. Even St. Paul says that, right? I pummel my body, or I discipline or I train my body to run the race. That's not just for the aspect of behaving well, but also in a prayer life, controlling it. So the big thing to understand is prayer is an elevation of our mind to God, and that means using our intellect and will, because the intellect is our mind. Remember, this is a continuation of prayer, so this is what we're trying to do that. But there's forces that prevent our minds from encountering God in prayer. And those forces are called distractions, okay? And we'll talk about those. But the fundamental principle of distraction that you must understand is this. And I talk about this, I believe, in episode 11, I believe. And that is it's an episode that I talk about the intellect. And to understand the intellect is one of the things that the intellect can only do is that it can only function on one thought at a time, okay? Here's what Father Martin says. It is well to note that our intellect functions in such a way that we can never have two thoughts at the same time. So we can't have two thoughts at the same time. We can only have one thought at a time. So the fundamental basic principle of distraction is that we cannot, think of two thoughts at the same time. Our intellect can't do that, okay? So if we are occupied in some thought, it'll be impossible for us at the same time to be conscious of another distinct thought. So if we're using our intellect to think about God, to elevate our mind to God, but these distractions come and distract our intellect, that's what causes us to have that distraction. So that's the fundamental principle of distraction, that we can't have two thoughts at the same time. And so what we have are these distractions that get elevated to the intellect that prevent us from thinking about God. So we think about something else. Maybe it's pain or something like that. Maybe it's an emotional problem that we have. Maybe it's preoccupied by another thought. You're going to have all of these, and so the distractions gently or forcefully has our mind preoccupied about that event as opposed to occupying the prayers. Okay? So it's very, very important to understand. Prayer is the elevation of the mind, which means that we have to use our intellect and our will. We have to will and control our intellect so that we choose prayer, that what we're doing. And distractions, the principle of distraction is that we cannot have two thoughts at the same time. So we have to pray and elevate our mind, or something else is going to distract us. Now, that does not mean that we can't do two things at the same time, okay? You can actually do vocal prayer, like the Hail Mary, like the Rosary, which is a vocal prayer, which you're constantly just saying, Hail Mary, full of grace, and yet still meditate on the mystery, because you're not having two thoughts at the same time. Because you can actually have your body do something and your mind thinking of something else, okay? How many of us have driven a car, literally miles and miles and miles from one destination to another, yet our mind is preoccupied with work or family events that we wonder, how did we ever get from point A to point B, right? That's because our body can go into autopilot mode while our mind is still thinking of something else. So that's like the Rosary. Rosary is just vocally saying the Hail Mary, and we can think about the mysteries, okay, or even the Hail Mary itself. Another good example of that is when we're doing labor work, okay? When we're, maybe let's say we're digging a hole, right? We can dig a hole and yet still think about God, because manual labor doesn't preoccupy the mind, especially simple manual work, right? Doesn't preoccupy the mind. Now, white-collar jobs, like for me, for example, I'm a computer scientist, so I develop software. It would be nearly impossible for me to think about an algorithm or code a solution and at the same time pray, because my mind is occupied in solving a problem, okay? So I can't do two tasks at the same time. So I want to kind of emphasize that it doesn't mean that we can't do two things. It just means that our mind can't think of two thoughts at the same time. So now let's talk about the 4 distraction points that enter our soul, okay? They're pretty basic. The first is external senses. The external senses are touch, taste, see, hear, smell, okay? Our body has those external senses that give feedback to eventually our intellect, okay? Sometimes, I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth later, but let me list the second one. The second distraction point is our passions. Our passions are basically our feelings and emotions, okay? And so those will get riled up, and that will cause us to be distracted. The third is preoccupation and wandering of the intellect, okay? A lot of times when we're praying, we will sometimes have our minds thinking of something else, or it will wander on something else, or we think about work, right? It's preoccupied about work. And that's what happens. So that's the third distraction. The fourth distraction, and it's similar to the wandering intellect, but it gets a little bit deeper. It is sin and scruples. This deals with our conscience, okay? So sometimes our conscience, which is harder to remove, gets occupied by sin or scruples, right? Sin is, when we commit a mortal sin and we're so distraught about the mortal sin, or we think we're not going to be forgiven, or we're not worthy. All these things are going to happen. Or scruples is when we make something small, maybe a venial sin, into something bigger than what it really should be, and that occupies our mind. So those are the 4 distraction points. And we're going to go over them, and we're going to talk about how to overcome them, how they distract us, and how to overcome them. Okay. So the first is the external senses. The external senses is, as I said, is touch, taste, see, hear, smell. And the thing about our external senses is a lot of times when our external senses wants to chase after things that are pleasurable, okay, and avoid pain. So our external senses always wants to avoid pain and seek pleasure. So because of that, we are, when we don't get what we want, so in other words, our body always wants pleasure. So as soon as it feels pain, because it doesn't get what it wants, the secondary effect of pain or of our external senses is that it affects our emotions. Okay, our emotions are affected, our passions are affected, usually because we get frustrated, right? So how many of us, we get, let's say, a baby's crying at mass, and that noise bothers us, and because it causes pain, and because it does not, I can't avoid that pain, it starts becoming annoying. And that annoyance becomes, basically short-tempered, right? You start getting annoyed, you start getting frustrated because you can't escape it. And then frustration is a form of anger, which is part of our passions. So the external senses not only affect our body, but also sometimes, most of the time actually, affects our passions. Okay? Now you have 2 sensory inputs going into our intellect. One is the pain that we're suffering through, and the second is the emotional or our passions getting all riled up because we can't avoid the pain. Okay? And so we get angry and frustrated, and now our intellect is preoccupied by both the passion and the external senses. So how do we avoid that? Okay? How do we avoid that? Now, this topic is just about the external senses, so we're going to talk about how do we avoid that, right? Well, the first is really to understand about pain is this. You have to embrace the pain. Okay? I'm going to tell you that. That's the reason why the Marines had it so tough. Because the toughness allowed us to embrace the pain. Pain is relative. It really is in many cases. If a person who's not used to pain, well, like especially a baby, the pain is a lot worse than a grown adult who has felt many different kinds of pains in his or her life. So you have to embrace the pain. If did you ever wonder why a lot of saints were poor and had a rough life? Well, that poverty and rough life, really kind of trains them to have basically a peaceful and calm prayer life. It really does, because nothing allows that, because they've had so much a duress, stressful physical life. One moment of little pain is almost like no pain for them. Okay, so they're almost getting trained by their what we call passive penance. Now, one of the I'll call it spiritual occupational hazards that first world countries have is that we are inundated with luxury, with almost zero pain. This is one of the biggest problems we have in America, is that most people don't know what it means to struggle. I mean, yes, we have poverty out there and everything else, but nothing compared to where it is at the level of India or South America, some parts of South America, Central America. Nowhere near like Middle East where there's war-torn Iraq and Syria. It's, here we have very, very little pain, you could say. So in reality, in a first world country, we actually create our own pain in many cases. The biggest problem we have in America and most first world country is psychological issues. Well, why is that? Well, I think mainly because we really don't know how to cope with pain, especially when pain starts getting elevated, okay? Especially if we live in a sheltered community, which a lot of times we are. And then just a slight little pain makes them all like, oh my goodness, the world's coming to an end. So in the Marines, we don't have that problem because we lived in a very stressful environment and did that. When people are yelling and screaming at you, when bombs are blowing up, when you're firing guns that could, accidentally kill other people. Again, I was never in combat, but we had a lot of real life situations where we used live fire and you could get easily killed if someone makes a mistake. So we have to embrace the pain. We have to do it. And the way that we do that is by doing active penance. I'm very big on active penance for several reasons. One is because Our Lady asked for it at Our Lady of Fatima. She said, people are going to hell because there's no one to do penance or suffer for them and pray for them. It's not enough that we just pray for people, but we should offer sacrifices for people. And one of them is through penance. So active penance. So that's one reason why. The second reason why active penance is great is because it exercises our virtue and allows us to have a better prayer life. Yes, it does. It actually does. So you can do active penance like kneeling, right? In the beginning, kneeling is going to hurt. And you might only be able to kneel for a minute or two. But I can venture to say that the kneeling is going to be easier and that you're going to be able to kneel longer. Your back's going to get stronger. Your legs are going to get stronger. Your everything's going to get stronger. So by doing active penance, all right, you will actually help out with distractions from our external senses, right? I'll give you an example. One of the penance I do is I don't put the air conditioner on in the summer or the heater on in the wintertime in my car, unless I have people in it, because I don't like to give penance to other people. But that's my personal penance. And so we have a car that the air conditioning isn't working, and we have a car that an air conditioner is working. And so my two sons and my wife are constantly battling over the car that has air conditioning. And I mean, it's hot without the air conditioning, but it's not unbearable. But the reason why they're battling it is because they are so used to that comfort zone of the air conditioning. Yet if they were to stop just using it and offered it up, they would realize that they're pretty attached to the air conditioning and even to the heating. Okay? So embracing the pain and doing active penance. Okay? The next is desire suffering. There's actually, it's funny because I used to read about how great saints would desire suffering. And mainly they're doing it to mimic Christ. And I agree, and that's what you should be doing it for. But certainly the secondary reason is that you can embrace the pain, right? You can actually endure more and more pain when you have more and more pain. Does that make sense? So the point I'm getting at here is the fact that by embracing the pain, your threshold of pain level will get higher and higher, that even slight little pains will no longer be distractions, okay? I do my prayers at airports, on the train. I do it where it's noisy, but I'm able to block all that out. Now, was I able to do that in the beginning? No, I wasn't. but eventually I was able to block even the noise out, okay? The third is to avoid luxury and pleasure, okay? That's as I said, that's an occupational spiritual hazard in America, in a first world country. We have luxury that is just thrown out at us. Do it the hard way, you know? One of the penance that I do is I don't park I come into work pretty early in the morning. So I have the choice of all the parking spaces. So I can park very close to the door to the building, or I can park very far. What do I choose? Park very far, okay? I don't have all the luxuries and amenities. And my kids will say that about the car, like, Dad, well, you got enough money to get a Mercedes, okay? Why not get a Mercedes? And I don't want to get entrapped by all the luxury that's there. Yeah, maybe when I'm like 90 years old and I can't do much things, I'll get a better car. So it's a safety issue, but I don't want to be trapped in that luxury. If you look at St. Francis, he pummeled his body. He used to call his body the ass, okay? He wound up actually eating a cookie on his deathbed to finally reconcile with his ass, which he called his body. So that's what we can do. The first step is to embrace the pain and get used to the pain, because it will get less and less. The second thing that we can do to avoid to help fight the distraction of external senses is to focus on what you are praying. This is so important, okay? Focus on what you're doing, okay? So I'm going to tell you this little steps and gradations when it comes to external senses. So the first thing that's going to happen when you, let's say, kneel. Let's say you kneel, right? And let's say you never knelt in praying ever. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to feel the pain that's going to enter your knees and register in your intellect. It's going to be like, wow. Okay, let's say you're kneeling on a stone floor for the first time, all right? And you're used to kneeling on, let's say, a padded cushion. You're going to feel that pain. It's going to jolt you. Now, what's going to happen is that your emotions are going to get riled up, because the first thing your emotions is saying is, hey, body, I want to avoid this pain, right? So when that starts occurring and you see that start inundating your mind, your intellect, your external senses, your knees saying, ow, 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 and your passion going, oh, I got to stop this. This is annoying. This is bothering me. You have to do this. And the first thing is focus on the prayer. First, stay focused on just saying the prayer. So for example, if I start kneeling, the first thing I want to just focus on, almost visualize it. Say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Just like if they were like, to me, I envision like they're kind of like bullets, Hail Mary. And I'm just saying the words, okay, and staying focused. When I stay focused on what I'm saying, the prayer that I'm saying, then what happens is the mind starts getting less occupied with the pain and the emotion. The first that's going to leave is typically your emotion, this emotional feeling of like, oh my goodness, I'm getting frustrated. And you can just kind of bat that out. And then eventually the pain usually is there, okay? And you can still feel somewhat of the pain, but it's going to start becoming like a numbing pain. But you can just say, Hail Mary, full of grace. The second phase after you do that is then start thinking about what you're really saying. Hail Mary, oh hail, or lady, oh favorite one, my mother, okay? And then start focusing on it. The next level is when you can unite your meditation to the pain you're feeling. So now, let's say I'm doing the Hail Mary and all of a sudden I'm meditating on Christ and his suffering on the cross. And now that slight pain that I feel, I'm no longer emotionally tied to it. I've been able to calm my passions. I can then take that slight pain feeling, not the enormous pain feeling I felt the first time I knelt, but just that slight pain, and then use that as my meditation. This is how Christ felt when he fell for the first time with the cross. This is how he felt the pain. And then uniting that suffering and pain in that prayer. So, and then what we do is then we can measure our pain, and once we measure it to Christ's pain on the cross and the passion, you're going to realize how petty that pain really is, okay? And that's what happens. And that happened to me in real life, and I do that. I was in Rome many years ago on a pilgrimage, and we were able to go up the Scola Sancta. That's basically Latin for the holy stairs. And it's right next to the St. John Lantern. And basically, it's the stairs that led to the Praetorium where Christ was crucified. So Jesus actually walked up and down these stairs. Now, they're covered in wood because the original is actually made of stone. And so the stone, because it's getting worn out, was covered with wood. And so the tradition has it that you have to go up these stairs on your knees. And in the beginning, the pain was excruciating. Now, I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but it was pretty excruciating going up there. But it's exactly what I said. I started focusing on saying the Hail Mary as I was going up. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Then as I went up to another one, I would do another Hail Mary. Then I started meditating. And as soon as I started focusing on saying the Hail Mary, the words, just the words, I could see my passions, my annoyance started dwindling. The pain was still there. But then as I started then meditating, right, that discursive meditation, that affective prayer, you can then start, the pain starts reducing very lightly. You'll still feel the pain. And I think God does that because he wants you to elevate that pain to that meditation. And that's what I did. I elevated to that meditation. And once I did that, then there was no pain. Literally no pain when I got to that point. And I was able to go up the stairs. Now, so I was about 5 stairs away from finishing it when the priest who was running this pilgrimage yells at me and says, David, we're late and we need to get going. And so he blocks me out of this meditation, and all of a sudden the pain starts shooting up my legs because now I'm no longer in this meditative state. So that's the power of meditation. That's how you control what occurs with your external senses. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the 5 senses, okay? Most of our sins come from 2 of the major senses, and that is the majority comes from the sense of sight. Seeing is the worst of them all, okay? That's the biggest sense. And touch, okay, is the second. If you notice, Jesus, when he says, it's better to go into heaven with your eyes gouged out or your hands broken, notice he picks those 2, okay, organs, the hand and the eyes. The eyes for sight and the hands for touching, right? Those are the 2 main ways of getting sin into the world. So, but those are also 2 ways of also becoming holy if we put our eyes and our sense of touch towards God. So understand those 2 senses are very important. I'll talk a little bit about that parable further down on there. Okay. So summarize external senses to avoid that distraction, embrace the pain. Embrace it. Do some active penance, desire the suffering, and then do your utmost. Try to avoid luxury and pleasure. Second is once you're in that painful situation, focus on your prayer. Focus on the words you're saying. Just focus on the words. Hail Mary, full of grace, The Lord is with thee. And then after you do that, start the discursive meditation. Think about what the words are saying. And then try to get some emotional buy-in with those words that you're understanding in that prayer. And before you know it, you'll unite the pain that you're suffering with your meditation. And then you won't feel anything. So the second distraction point is our passions. Our passions are basically our feelings and emotions. The causes of our passions being riled up are typically a pain. We just talk about that. Pain causes us frustration because we can't avoid it. The other thing it does is it also what creates our passions to be riled up is perceived pain or perceived pleasure. Okay, it doesn't matter, right? If it's perceived. It's that worry war person, right? It's a person who's always worrying. Oh, this might happen, that might happen. It's a perceived pain, okay? My son, when he was little, he would go through more pain contemplating getting a shot, because we used to get the flu shot a lot. And he used to, for hours, he would kick and scream before even getting the shot. And then once he got the shot, he was okay. So that perceived pain or perceived pleasure. How many times do we get preoccupied because we're expectation of this perceived pleasure, that's going to be going on? Situations cause our emotions to be riled up. A death, happiness, even it could be preoccupying, our emotions. Emotional pain that we face, a breakup or something like that. Firing of a job. You feel you're like a loser, and all those other things. So a situation will get our emotions all riled up. Pleasures, as we talked, luxury will also do it. So the best way to control our passions is to let it go. Let it go. I don't know how many people don't realize that part of their frustration, part of the pain, emotional pain that is not physical pain, those types of things is because we bottle them up. We bottle them up instead of letting it go. Let it go. There was a famous song a long time ago called "Don't Worry, Be Happy." Now, I'm not trying to say that I forget the name of the singer, but this should be your motto of prayer. But in essence, that's what it is. It's don't worry, be happy. It's if we truly trust God, then we don't worry. That's what Jesus was saying about the sparrow. Look at the flowers. There's nothing in Solomon time that could have made anything beautiful than a flower. And yet it blooms in the morning and then withers in the evening and is cast into the fire. But what's more important than that flower or you? Or what about the birds of the air who neither, sow or reap or farm, and yet God takes care of them? And yet the hair in your head is more important than even that one sparrow. So trust, let it go. Take deep breaths and just let it go. At least for that one moment in time. At least that one moment in time where you're doing your prayers, let that emotional feeling go. And the only one who can do that is you. I don't care if you're in the most quiet place in the world. If you're emotionally bottled up and your passions are bottled up, you're just a keg waiting to explode. You're a dynamite waiting to explode. But only you can let it go, to let that open and say, you know what? Take several deep breaths, exhale it out, and say, I let it go. For at least this moment where I'm doing a prayer, so I can reach the heights of heaven with God. And for that one moment in time, I can be with God. So that's what the biggest thing. So the technique is to breathe. Breathing, especially in the beginning, will help you. It will help you fight nervousness. The way that I learned about breathing, and I'm not talking about Lamaze, I'm not talking about anything special or Pilates, or some kind of yoga. I'm just talking about simple, basic breathe in, hold your breath a little bit, breathe out. I learned that when I was wrestling. I used to get incredible butterflies when I was wrestling. I mean, I'm talking about tons of butterflies. And when I played football, and football, what is it? It's 30 minutes each. So you're talking about almost 2 hours worth of football time. Getting butterflies for 4 minutes is not going to kill you. But in wrestling, you only have 6 minutes. 4 minutes of butterflies will kill you in a wrestling match. So I had to figure out a way to calm my nerves so that when he blows the whistle, I'm ready to wrestle and not be nervous. And I learned that by just sitting down and taking deep breaths and stretching out. Just doing basic stretches. That's what it is. So by breathing, it causes your heart rate to slow down and to become more rhythmic. It eliminates all of the effects of our passions on our body. When we get angry or embarrassed or nervous, it affects our body. Nervousness, we can throw up, we feel sick. When we get embarrassed, we feel all flushed, right? So by breathing, we're actually countering our passions through our bodies. It's like the opposite effect, right? By calming our body, by controlling our body, we will then control our passions. Okay? So our passions, let it go psychologically, emotionally, and then learn to breathe. So that's how we control our second distraction, which is our passions. The third distraction is preoccupation and wandering of the intellect. A lot of times, sometimes you go into mass or maybe you're doing prayer and the only thing you're thinking about is work, right? Like, all right, I have to go to this meeting, I have to go to that meeting. I wonder what, when I went to that meeting, the guy said certain things and what am I supposed to say? You gotta check that in at the door. You can't let that in during mass or even at your prayer time. Okay? Because remember, we can't occupy the intellect can't handle two thoughts at the same time. So preoccupation, and that could be our family life. What doctor should I take my daughter to? Or Betty was doing this and that. You have to let it go. Basically not let our be preoccupied by thoughts of our family, by everything else. You have to put on your, I say this, put on your game face and focus on the prayer. Everything else is just a distraction. And do that. Or we let our mind wander, right? So maybe you're not preoccupying yourself, but you just let your mind kind of wander, and not focus on the prayer or focus on the priest or what's going on at the mass. So the way that you fight this preoccupation is one is let whatever is in your mind go. Okay? Just let it go. Just don't worry about it. All right? I want to tell you this little story. I took a time management course a long time ago. I want to say maybe almost like 10, 15 years ago. And it was interesting. But one of the things that came out of that I still use to this day is this tool called the holding pen. Okay? And the holding pen is pretty interesting. It's an interesting concept. So what the instructor was saying was that a lot of our frustration comes from the fact that we're trying to do two things in our mind intellectually at the same time. And because of that, we get frustrated. Now, I'll give you an example. So let's say I am driving from my house to Hartford, which is an hour and a half drive, because my customer in Hartford, I have to do a presentation. So as I'm driving up to Hartford, I'm practicing my presentation. So my mind is being preoccupied with the presentation that I have to say in front of my customer. As I'm doing that, a thought pops into my mind, And that is, I need to change the oil in my car. Okay? Now, remember, Father Morin's maxim, we can't have two thoughts at the same time. So now that thought of changing the oil in my car pops into my mind, and now I can't think about this presentation. So now I have a decision to make. My decision is either throw out the idea that of changing the oil in the car and focus on the presentation that I have to do, which means that I could possibly forget that I have to change the oil. Okay? Or I constantly tell myself, I got to change the oil in the car. I have to change the oil in my car. I have to change the oil in my car. And then I disregard preparing for the presentation. Okay? So now, if I preoccupy my mind about changing the oil in the car, then I won't forget that idea, but now I'm losing my mind, losing my practice time for the presentation. So it's a bad situation. So what the holding pen says is that there's a third option, and that third option is I have a pen and paper in my car that I quickly write, change oil in the car. By doing that, I now allow my brain to say, stop thinking about changing the oil in the car and start focusing on the presentation. That's called the holding pen. Well, that's the same thing with preoccupation and wandering of the intellect. Let it go. Just say it's unimportant and let it go. Now, one of the things I say, I have this saying, and you can take ownership of it as well, is I say to myself, anytime I have something on my mind that could possibly preoccupy me during Mass or prayer time, I just throw it out. I just say, you know what? I don't need to worry about it, because this is what I say. If I can't remember it, it wasn't important. That's basically what I say. If I can't remember it, then it must have been important. All right? So it's better for me just to throw it out. So when I'm at Mass, my full attention is entering the holy sacrifice of the Mass, or liturgy of the hours, or my prayer time. And then once it's done, then I go back and say, now what was I thinking about? Oh, okay, here and there. And there's a lot of times where I forgot. I'm like, all right. And then God will bring it up. Okay. So the point I'm getting at is shut it out. Shut out your preoccupation and control your intellect and follow what's going on. If you're at Mass, I use the Missal often, even though it's funny because a lot of the ordinary form people don't use, even the Missalette, let alone the Missal. I'm the only one that probably bought a Missal and actually follow and use the Missal. But I do that because it really helps me focus my intellect. It helps me focus, okay, we're in the preface. This is what he's saying. We're in the Eucharistic prayer. This is what he's saying. We're in the readings. And, a lot of priests say that, you shouldn't read while the lector is reading the readings, or the priest or deacon is doing the gospel readings. But I disagree with that. I'm a lot more focused. By doing both, by listening to the person who's doing the reading and by reading, it prevents my mind from wandering. That's what it does. But there's a lot of times where if I don't follow the Missal and I don't follow the reading, my mind starts wandering, especially if he or she's not a good reader. Okay, my mind will start wandering. And so by reading with the readers, by reading what the priest is saying, it focuses it in. So I highly recommend using, reading. I know memorization is very important, but I also like reading it through a book because it helps me visualize and look at the prayers, okay, and prevents me from my mind wandering. My mind will wander more when I do prayers out from my memory and I don't read it, or if I'm not following a Missal, if I'm going to Mass or other things. So, disagree or agree with me, I like following it with a book because it helps me focus and prevents me from wandering, my mind from wandering, okay? So the fourth and last distraction is sin and scruples. Sin and scruples. Sin, a lot of times when we're in a sinful state, okay, if you commit a mortal sin, you should always be going to Mass as quickly as possible. To confession as quickly as possible. But the way that you avoid that is just go to confession frequently, I try to go every other week, and by going to frequent confession, that you're probably near zero with the mortal sins. Yeah, you probably have some venial sins, but, by doing that, you're kind of somewhat clean, and that's not going to bother you. The other is scruples. What is scruples? Scruples is when you think you've done something worse than what it really is, okay? And by going again to frequent confession, you'll get corrected a lot by a priest that will help you cope with the scruples, because people have some scruples than others, more or less. So the best fix on this is to go to frequent confession once a week, or once every other week. So by doing that, you can get corrected with your scruples, and you're kind of clean in this sin area. But if you do have mortal sin, even mortal sin, do your prayers. Trust in God's mercy. Trust in His mercy. And then try to encounter Him as best as possible. Now, you'll never be as good as if you were holy and clean, but you can still encounter God's grace. There's not the sanctifying grace, but there's actual graces. And God always hears our prayers, regardless of what state we're in. So, and the reason why is so that we can get moved to go to confession. That's what we want to. That's why praying, even in mortal sin, will help you, prevent you from committing more mortal sin, but even more importantly, leading you back to that great sacrament called confession. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. So those are the 4 distractions. All right, and we talked about that. Now let's talk about steps to follow, no matter what condition you're in, before praying. So these are 6 steps, okay, that I broke down that you should take before you pray. Now, as you get better and better and you start doing this, it's going to take you less and less time to do this, because you're going to be able to train your intellect and your body to become better and more prayerful atmosphere. But if you're starting from ground zero and if you're starting from the basics, this is the steps that you need to take. First is prepare your prayers, okay? Do that. So if you're doing the Liturgy of the Hours, or if you're doing, let's say, a prayer that is, or the Rosary, or if you're doing some prayer in a prayer book, get that prayer book open that's in the page where you're going to start beginning to pray, okay? Because flipping through and trying to figure out what page you should be at a prayer, or, and doing that while you're trying to pray really is a distraction. And you can mitigate that by just first focus on and preparing the prayer. The second thing you want to do is get into the posture that is best for that prayer. So the typical posture is kneeling, sitting, or standing, okay? So, sometimes I kneel when I do my Liturgy of the Hours. Sometimes I sit. Sometimes I stand. It really depends, right? I stand if I'm tired. I kneel if I want to be more reverent, but I typically do it sitting. Some other prayers. So get into the posture. And the reason why is that certain postures, like kneeling and maybe even standing, you'll start feeling pain, right? Especially in kneeling, especially if you're kneeling on stone. You're going to start feeling that pain, okay? So you're going to start getting external senses and your passions start riling up. Again, this is before you're praying. So you're preparing. And so you kind of want to feel that pain. You kind of want to start feeling what the passions are going to do with that. Why? Because the next thing you're going to do is start focusing on calming your passions. How? By taking deep breaths, slowing your heart rate, right? Do this for about 30 seconds, right? Because maybe you're coming in and doing your prayer because you just yelled at your husband or your wife or your children, or maybe because you got frustrated at work. So you want to start calming those passions down. You want to calm the passions that are caused because maybe you're kneeling right now and the pain that you're feeling in kneeling is riling up your passions. So the first thing you want to do is calm those passions by taking deep breaths and then letting the passions go. Let it go. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on overcoming the external senses. We're going to do that by saying, I embrace this pain. And then we're going to start doing the prayer. But when we do the prayer, we're going to stay focused on the words. Okay? That's what we're going to do. Then, before we do the prayer, we're going to empty ourselves in our mind. So, for example, we're going to empty. So if we're coming into that prayerful state with things that are occupying our mind, maybe it's the frustrating boss, maybe it's the frustrating wife or the frustrating children, or maybe it's a job that you have to do. Empty all that out. Okay, you want to meet God and not have all these distractions there. All right, you want to trust God in any sins or scruples that might be agitating you. So if you have a sin or if a scruple is bothering you, just let it go and say to yourself, I trust in God. God, have mercy on me. Okay? And begin your prayer. And when you begin your prayer, focus on the vocal prayer first. Hail Mary. Visualize those words. Okay? That will help calm our external senses. That will get us in a good rhythm. And then after that, conscientiously understand the words that you're saying. This is called discursive meditation now. Hail Mary. Oh, how great you are. How, my mother. Those types of things. So you want to then do discursive prayer. Then what you want to do is start meditating. This is where we want to put our emotions in there, our feelings, so that we elevate to the effective prayer level, and then prayer simplicity, engrossing ourselves in that prayer, engrossing ourselves into it like it's a good movie or it's a good, wine or whatever it is. It's engrossing ourselves. And that's a true encounter with God in which we truly love him. Okay? So, bottom line, what is the bottom line? It is important to understand that effective prayer is in the intellect and must be willed. We need to train our intellect and will to pray calmly and peacefully by overcoming our distractions caused by our external senses, passions, preoccupation, and wandering of our mind, and any sin and scruples that distract us. As a soldier trains his intellect and will to focus in shooting his rifle accurately during combat, we must train our intellect and will to focus on our prayer. It is not the chaotic world that prevents us from peaceful and calm prayer. Listen to this. It is not the chaotic world that prevents us from a peaceful and calm prayer, but our lack of control in our will to focus our intellect on our prayer life. So, I'll read you one passage from 1 Corinthians. St. Paul says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners compete, but only one receive the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things." Listen to that, self-control in all things. "They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Well, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I pummel my body and subdue it, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." What he's saying is we need to be able to control ourselves in our prayer lives as well as in our virtues. And by doing that, by focusing on our prayer life first, we'll encounter God, love God, and it will motivate us to change who we are. So let's end it with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, we thank you for giving us the intellect and will to elevate our minds, this great gift. Help us to use it, help us to control it, and help us to love you more by elevating our mind through prayer. As we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Cease, at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect. Do I get distracted a lot? Is my mind racing along on secular thoughts, even at Mass and prayer time? How does noise impact my prayer life? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com. Join me next week as we continue to discuss the prayer and focus on spiritual dryness.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.